Hey everyone, welcome to the Walk to Wealth podcast. If you're tuning in on YouTube or any of the podcast directories, we just ask you one teeny tiny little favor. Make sure to follow and subscribe so I can keep on bringing high quality guests like the one I have today. Without further ado, Richard, for anyone that may not know you, tell us your elevator pitch. Who are you and what do you do?
Well, what I have done in the past has led me to my current path. And that is building a trading firm with traders. And it turned out that some of them were stuck and they had all the opportunities, they had the systems, they had the markets, but something was wrong. And that led me, with my background in psychology and as a therapist, to really look at what stops us from getting the goals around money, meaning, and success that we want. And I had the perfect laboratory because trading gives you an immediate feedback. I mean, just, hey, no messing around. I mean, it's not, well, he did well, excuses, well, the market, no, it's all there. And what I've discovered is that the same mental attitudes, the same issues we have, the same subconscious anchors all apply to everyone across the board. And that led me to write my book, A Private Conversation with Money.
All right. And Richard, now tell us a little bit about your walk to wealth. Before you got into writing a book, before you got into helping other traders reframe their mindsets around money, where does your journey all begin?
Yeah, well, I started as a retailer. I was a glass blower for many years to fairs and malls, and that taught me the basics of retailing. Then I went to Merrill Lynch as a salesman. Then I worked for an arbitrage firm out of Chicago, trading options. And then I built my own trading firm. Then I built a financial software firm with major patents and that are still used today across the country. And after I left that, then I thought, what am I going to do with my life? I have a psychology background as a therapist. I understand markets. And what I see, especially culturally today, is people are stressed around money. They're out of rapport with money and wealth. There's internal struggles. There's cultural beliefs. There's stuff that we just bring with us from our families of origin around money is the root of all evil. Money is tight. Whoopee, if you got it, just spend it. All these different messages that don't get you to your goals.
So then let me ask you mentioned too about like all these different factors about our upbringing, our families. Tell us a little bit about what was the money like in your household growing up? What was the conversation on money? Was it something that was more taboo? Tell us about that because you help other people reframe. Did you have to reframe your own mindsets around money? Like how was that in your earlier years?
Well, it's interesting in that I still have some of my grandparents' depression mentality around being very careful with money and saving it. My parents were lower middle class when I was growing up. My dad was a preacher and there wasn't much money around at all. Then my dad went into business and he made a lot of money, lost a lot of money, made a lot of money, lost a lot of money. So the grounding I have is still from my grandparents' depression mentality. When I saw my dad go up and down with all this stuff and also living without a lot of money, I now have, I think, a good will in that I'm still very careful about money and I don't have to worry about finances.
Yeah. And can you tell us a little bit before we get into today's conversation, what was it like in your teenage years? Did you have your mindset set around and kind of what you wanted to do? Do you have it all figured out? Or what was it like kind of trying to navigate the world back in your early 20s and your teenage years?
I had no idea what I wanted to do. And so I got a BA in philosophy, a master's degree in clinical psychology, and then felt really lost because I grew up in a very tight religious household in my early days. And I lost that specific religion. And so there was some loss around meaning. What am I doing? What am I contributing to life? And I think the turning point for me was after I left the trading firm, I was on my own and I was trading, and very carefully, the first year I was on my own, I made $125,000. Not bad, but low risk, very careful. The next year, 150, 175. It was amazing. Just 25,000, then 200,000 and 200,000. I was stuck there. And it was April of 1995. In the middle of the night, I heard a voice. And the voice said, "You're only worth $200,000. I woke up. I looked around the room. My wife was sleeping beside me, not awake. There was nobody else there. But there was this voice that said I wasn't worthy. So I got up, I showered, I dressed, I drove to the floor of the Pacific Exchange where I was a market maker. Got there so early. In fact, the doors weren't even open. And I started thinking about that voice. What was going on? What was that unworthiness about? The doors opened, and you young people don't know anything about trading pits. It's all on the screen. It's all automatic now. But in the pits, it was kind of like a jungle. And I always stood at the back, very carefully looking at option values and stock values and trading very carefully. But this time I did something different. I went and stood right in the best spot in the pit, right between the two busiest brokers and the book staff where you get orders. But you got to understand that those best spots, you don't buy them or rent them. They're held by the biggest bully, the toughest guy, the person with the most capital. In other words, if you think of a real brutish social hierarchy, you can think of that top spot as the big but toughest. So I went and stood there. So the rest of the market makers and brokers all started coming in. And the guy who always stood there stood beside me, watching the clock, trying to figure out what the, you can't swear on this.
You swear, go ahead.
What the fuck was Rich Friesen doing in my spot? So just before the bell, he tapped me on the shoulder. I didn't move. The bell went off, and I'm going to go back from the microphone because I don't want to blow your ears out. Buy 500, sell you 20, buy 30, Friesen. The pit thought Rich Friesen had gone crazy. But that year, I went on to make $650,000, and years after that, made a lot of money. And I realized that the difference was that demon inside of me, that feeling of self not being worthy, that not being enough competent. And I went on, took that money to build a trading firm. And lo and behold, I had a system that just ground out money. 1/3 of the traders just took off and made money. 1/3 of the traders, they did good. They did okay, made money. But 1/3 couldn't make any money or lost money. So I figured maybe, just maybe, what if they had an internal limitation like I did? So I brought in a hypnotherapist. Turned out my sister was newly minted from hypnotherapy school, very eager to come in. And we discovered, for example, one trader, his father was an immigrant and worked very hard, 2 and 3 jobs to make money. And he subconsciously believed, I know this isn't rational, but he believed that if he made more money than his dad, it would be disrespectful. Another trader had a handicapped younger brother that needed a lot of attention, medical attention, and he grew up being very jealous of him. And he knew if he made a lot of money, his mother would come for him and ask him to finance all the care that his younger brother needed. How did he solve it? Simple, just not make money. Another trader came from West Virginia, dirt poor, cousins, uncles, huge families. And if he made money, he knew he would lose all that connection to his family because they would resent it or would think he was better than himself or whatever. So how did he solve it? Just not make money. So it turned out this was the start of my journey to thinking, what if our abilities, our future, our wealth, all were limited with the subconscious anchors? And that's where I wrote the book, A Private Conversation with Money, to expand that, what I learned about myself and from the other traders, to expand that to every walk of life.
Yeah. So let's take it back a little bit to that day, the day you heard the voice that made you wake out of bed and look over at your wife in the middle of the night. what made you hear that voice? Because a lot of the time we have a voice and we either ignore it, we can't hear it, we pay it no mind, we may be willfully blind and maybe turning like a blind eye to it because, right,
Mhm.
with awareness comes responsibility, right? They say,
With
right?
awareness comes responsibility. Boy,
Yeah, ignorance is bliss, right? When you don't know anything, you can enjoy life peacefully, everything's happy. But the more you know, that's when responsibility comes. So, what was that like? Hearing that voice, having a clear mindset, because I feel like now with everything nowadays with social media, everything's so fast paced. It's
mhm.
hard to really get to tune into our thoughts and what we're saying to ourselves because we're just so on go. We never take the chance to slow down and actually hear what's going on to assess what even are our internal beliefs about ourselves.
Well, John, one thing I appreciate about you right now is you asked the right hard question. There was something in me that was just ready to explode. In other words, this tension was getting so great that that voice finally said, I'm going to wake him up in the middle of the night. He doesn't freaking hear me. What's wrong with him? I'm going to have to scare the shit out of him. So what you're talking about is so important that we learn to listen to all of those voices. So like, for example, I have a money metric application, and that money metrics application is geared to allow us listening to that voices. Like it logs our sensations, our physical sensations. My stomach's tight. I'm not breathing. My legs bouncing up and down. I got a headache in the back of my neck, those kind of things. Then our emotions. Am I feeling happy, lost? Am I feeling exuberant? Am I feeling cocky? Am I depressed? And then we look also at the quality of our thoughts. And we get, am I being judgmental? Are my thoughts optimistic? Are they thinking about a bright future? Are they always worried about something? So by expanding our awareness and what I call our set scores, we can now start to pay attention and get more sensitive to listening to those voices. So the question you asked, I think, is probably one of the most important questions.
And so then to follow that question up, then how do we know whose voice it is that we're hearing? I feel like a lot of times now too, with all the especially societal pressures to now, especially for people my age, right? Because this is what most of my listeners are. Go the traditional route. You got to go to school. You got to get your degree, especially for
Mm-hmm.
immigrants, right? They tie the pinnacle of American success to getting a degree, right?
Mm-hmm.
And because that's all they know when they come into this country.
Right.
And it's like you have to go to school, you have to do this and get a good job and work till you die, right? And uh, some of the times the voices that we're hearing in our heads aren't our own. So how do we distinguish that voice between the voice that's actually supposed to be guiding us in this journey that we're on versus the voices that we have of our parents or maybe our friends or maybe a coach or a mentor or a loved one that has good intentions but is imposing some type of limiting anchor kind of on us.
Oh, man. Boy, you do ask the good questions. So what I do is if we go through this awareness and like for somebody will say something like, oh, I really got to do A, B, C, and X, Y, Z. I got to do it. Ah, okay. Can I have, what's that voice? Would you give it a name, that name that says you got to do something? Yeah, it's should. Okay, let's call him should. May I have a conversation with should? Huh? Yeah, I'd like to talk to should. May I do it? Hey, okay. So I'll say should. Bob has given me permission to talk to you, and I'd like to understand what's going on better. And I want you to know that I believe you have a positive intent for his life. You have a positive intent. And with that belief, may I have a conversation with you? Should. And sometimes there's some confusion, but sometimes there's absolute clarity. Sure, you can talk to me. Bob doesn't listen to me. I'd love to be heard. Okay, should. What is your purpose? What are you doing for him? Oh, if I wasn't there, he would just lay on the couch and play video games and wouldn't do anything at all. So I'm there to keep him busy. Oh, that's a good intent. And then we can work down. And sometimes I'll ask, how old was Bob when you saw you needed to come to him? And they'll give an age of like 5 or 6 or 8 or whatever it is. and we'll talk. And then sometimes I'll say, this sounds like his mom, or could voice kind of sounds like your dad. You say, yeah, I got this from my dad or my mom or an uncle or whatever. So these voices can come from a number of places, and sometimes they come as reaction to abuse, reaction to emotional pain. Our survival mechanisms come in. So these voices can come from a variety of sources. And the question that you ask is really a good one, because once we can just drill down on the source of the voice and assume it's positive intent, then we can work up from there.
So then let me kind of ask you, because a lot of these voices, as I said, they come from good intention and they are to help us out. How do we, I guess, let's say our parents, for example, like you said that your grandparents had that, like that depressionary mindset where it's like you have to save all your coins away because a bad day is going to come, right?
Right,
And
right.
and so how do you kind of take the good from it, right, and extract only the good parts of the voice while leaving out the bad parts so that you don't get confined to the same thing that your parents or maybe your friends or loved ones might have been constrained to, and you're able to take the good and flourish from it, but without taking the negativity that may be hidden behind what they're trying to say?
Oh man, you're really going after it. Okay, so what my assumption always is that are these voices, these anchors, these survival mechanisms, they all have at some point a positive intent. So we work on what's the positive intent of you should get to work. You should do this. And if you don't, you're an idiot. You need to keep doing it. You should do it. So there's this voice that's just like a parent who's beating you up. Okay, what's the positive intent? It wants you to survive and thrive. Okay, so now we get down to the point where I can talk to the voice and say, so you want Bob just to thrive, do you? Yeah, I want him to thrive. And how you do it is beating him up. Is that right? Yeah. What if we could find a better method for you to encourage Bob to survive, not only survive, but to thrive? Would you be willing to do it? Now, occasionally I'll get the voice say, nope, that mother, I'm going to keep beating him up. Okay, then we can have a different conversation. But almost always that voice will say, how has it worked for him? Beating him up like this. Has this really been productive? What's the outcome? Hasn't worked too well. Would you be willing to upgrade your skills? Okay. So what if you were to invite Bob into a space that felt so good, felt so much better, more meaningful, more productive, more, if it was a male, it would be stepping into your masculinity, stepping into your power. Could you increase your skill level so that you made it an invitation to something better rather than beating him up for being a bad guy?
Yeah. So, and that brings a pretty interesting point, because there's one thing I heard somewhere, right? And it was saying that if we talk to our friends the way a lot of us talk to our inner selves, right? We wouldn't have many friends, right? Because we tend to be a lot harsher on ourselves than we are on other people. And if we took the time to really examine our own inner dialogue from like a third party point of view, it would seem that a lot of us aren't really friends with ourselves, right? Based on how we talk to each other. So how can we get on the same page so that our inner dialogue is one of friendship kind of, and not one of negativity? Because there's always tough love, right? You got to be hard, yeah, and tough love, but it's also, would you do that to your bestest friend or to your life partner, right? Or your wife, your husband, whatever it may be? Would you talk to yourself that way? It's always the question. And a lot of people wouldn't. So how do you get on the same side of your inner dialogue so you're not bashing yourself and you're actually, as you're saying, you're not just surviving, you're thriving, right?
Well, that's where we have what I call the golden keys. And the golden keys unlock that conversation. So first, there's awareness. What are my thoughts? So like one of the exercises we'll do is on my phone, I have an app that every 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes just goes beep, beep. And then I do a check. What are my physical sensations? So right now I'm going to do this. I just noticed my stomach is tight. I don't, what's going on? I'm getting excited. My stomach's tight. I'm kind of hunching over. Okay. This is better. Oh man, this feels better. What are my emotions? I'm excited. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm pleasantly amazed at your insights, and the questions you're asking are just so good. So there's that pleasure just talking to you. And so, now I'm feeling relaxed. So first there's the awareness. What are the quality of my thoughts? Am I beating myself up? Am I being creative? Am I accepting? And that leads us to the next golden key. The first is awareness. The second is acceptance. What if I'm aware, I become aware of thoughts I have, and then I beat myself up I beat myself up for beating myself up. So the next one is acceptance. No matter what I discover, it's okay. And the third step then is agency. So if we are aware of what's going on and we can be aware of it while it's going on, then this eventually can lead to even a higher level of what I call agency. And that's the ability to not only just be aware, but to create responsibility and make decisions about how we want to experience our life. So it's awareness, acceptance, and then agency.
Yeah. And so then kind of let me ask you now, because, right, you get to a point where you kind of mentioned, as you said, we beat ourselves up. And then once we realize that we were beating ourselves up, we tend to beat ourselves up because we beat ourselves up. But then there's also a group of people that beat themselves up. They know they're beating themselves up, but that's because that's all they know, right? Because they had to live off of that for so long. So how do we start to unravel that? Because it gets to a point where it's like, you just stuck in that framework for so long. And as you already know, the way our neurons connect, it's hard to try to create a new habit to form something, especially when there's trauma or things like that nature that are kind of underneath it, right? So how do we unravel those things when we're stuck in that cycle of like, man, this is all I know?
Yeah, I'm just looking up a book here that kind of, if I can find it quickly, You Can't Hurt Me by David Goggins. So David Goggins was mistreated, traumatized, beaten as a child. And so in his growth path, what did he do? Everyone admires him for running these races and pushing through when his feet were all blistery and sore and bleeding, doing pull-ups when his hands were all this stuff. But I have a different framework. He was abused as a child. And in all the things he didn't do proper preparation, but it was a substitute to beat himself up. And so what you're saying is our survival mechanisms, for example, a very clear example that is played out for many women is if they were abused by a father, they tend to find mates who also abuse them. Why? Because they know they can survive it. For example, when I grew up, my father was a narcissist and gone a lot, and my mom was depressed. I learned how to survive without a lot of feminine love and attention and hugs and all that good stuff. So what do I do now? Is I set up situations where I can experience my survival mechanism because I know I can survive that. But could I survive warm, huggy, lovable? No. So we all recreate our survival mechanisms, because we can survive them and we know, but we don't know we can survive something better. Crazy, isn't it?
You remind me of a little point. I don't know. You might know him because you said you're into philosophy. A guy by the name of Jordan Peterson. He said something along the lines of, the devil we know isn't always better than the devil we don't, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it brings up the thought of just because we've survived one way of living, right? Whether that's, growing up with a depressed lack of a female, that's feminine energy, or it's growing up with an abusive father, right? That's like the devil we know, right? And the devil we don't know is growing up with a father that isn't abusive or grown up with a mother who provided that, right? And sometimes that what we don't know is actually a lot better for us and it'll help us to thrive.
Right.
But because we're so used to knowing that we survived this one bad thing, although it's bad, at least we know we made it to other side. So how can we kind of reframe our mindset so that we can head towards a thing that we may not know what the actual outcome, but may actually be better for us than what we're currently in?
Oh boy, that brings up so many things. So we'll just narrow it down here. So our brains will not take us to a place that aren't safe. So how can we make a different context, if we look at a whole context, safer? And one way is guided visualizations. For example, I will have somebody construct a house, their ideal house. Oftentimes it's by a lake or in the mountains or by the ocean. It's in a valley, whatever, this beautiful house. And I will have them approach the house, put their hand on the door. We're imagining all this. We've spent maybe half an hour, 45 minutes describing the house. And in this house is the whole new context without that previous survival mechanism. And I'll say, are you willing to let go of that survival mechanism and step into the new house? About a quarter of the time, they'll say, no, I'm not ready yet. And we'll have to go back and do some work. But when they're ready to step into it, they experience it. Are you safe? And one of the things that's really important, I have them go out on the porch, look back at all the people in their life, live or dead, whole group of them, and say, who is objecting? Oh my God, my mom hates this. She wants to keep me dependent. Oh, Jesus. So what we do then is to deal with all the cultural, family, all the social pressure, because when we step into this new house, when we step out of an old behavior, we're also changing our relationships to other people. And if we don't recognize that and learn how to mitigate it, like a rubber band, that's right, for the Godfather, they just hold me back.
Yeah. So then let me ask you, because especially 'cause you said you studied philosophy, so I think it's okay that we get a little deep into
Sure.
some questions. So as you probably know, right, we all as humans, right, have an intrinsic nature to just ruin things, right? For example, with the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, right? Everything was perfect, everything was in harmony, and we ruined that. And humans tend to, for whatever reason, if we did have like a perfect utopia, humans would find a way to create some form of chaos, right? Just to get some excitement, right? So how do we get into that new house and enjoy that without reverting back to the chaos that we were once in? How do we get away from that chaos?
Yeah, you keep asking the tough question. Yeah, that's the core question. How do we step into a new life that feels better, honors our values, and gets us to our goals? And you have a really important point in that we need challenges in life. And that's especially concerning about young people, and especially young men in today's culture. And you would know more about that. I'm 75, so although I do have kids and grandkids, but the culture that you're familiar with, I see a lot of men that are lost. And you mentioned Jordan Peterson. I've had 2 clients come to me and say, Jordan Peterson saved my life and he doesn't even know it. So what if we had meaning? What if we had a vision? What if we had a goal? And what if that goal was to add value to other people's life? And in my book, A Private Conversation with Money, if we just distill it down and we watch Joe, the main character, go through all the issues in his life, and when he comes out to a personal mission that adds value to the world, then all of a sudden, all these other things don't matter. Like if you try to stop an addiction, it's really a challenge. But if you step from an addiction into another world, then all of a sudden that becomes easier. So for me and work with my clients is to let's create a vision for your life, and let's create one where it honors your values, yet you can develop your skills, you can deliver value, get the rewards from your family, your culture, your clients, your employees, your employers, or whatever, then once that mission is there, then all the other side issues, all the other problems don't have nearly as big as impact.
Yeah. So then let me ask you, because our past is kind of what shaped us. And no matter, how focused on our mission and maybe that new world that we enter into that new house as, to go back to the analogy that you used earlier, but how do we really dissociate from that old identity so that it's harder to turn back? I feel like the past is these experience we learn from, we grow from eventually. But like a lot of the times, people kind of they don't fully integrate with their past or their shadows, right? They kind of yeah, that happened before, and they try to say, but that's not me anymore, right? They try to dissociate from it in a way like
Right.
that's not them, instead of learning and embracing that and what that happened and taking as much as they can from it. So what advice, what exercises can you have for people there so that they don't ignore their past, they actually embrace it and can fully move on from it instead of just trying to keep it hidden and tucked away?
Well, there's a couple of things. One is the mental model that I use is that these old past patterns are neurological connections in our brain. Like learned to drive a motorcycle a couple decades ago. And at first, oh my God, everything. How do you do it? How do you stop fast? How do you keep from sliding? How do you turn a corner? First, I tried it like in a car. I turned left to go left. Hey, that doesn't work. You fall over. So learning the corner, learning to accelerate.
Yeah.
And so but now, well, I sold my motorcycle, but now I could get on a motorcycle and it'd be just smooth. Why? I had all these old patterns from driving a car that just didn't serve me well. Then I developed all sorts of new patterns after a couple of decades of riding that served me better. So if we think of stepping into a new context as creating new neural connections, well, that still means we have the old things back here and we're going to get triggered and go back. And you can say, the old patterns just got triggered. That's interesting. And creating these new neural patterns and these neural connections, at first, it's like driving. So you have to really concentrate. But after a while, they become part of you. And what you said was so important is that, I'm not going to do that anymore. Oh, that a part of me is not going to be part of me. Well, that's creating more internal stress. So if we use that model, then we're more forgiving if we just see them as neural patterns rather than a moral failing. And the other thing to do is to look at context. And we can go into that a bit more if you want. I don't know how much time we have, but happy to discuss that too.
Yeah, definitely. Let's get into it a little bit. In terms of context, what do you mean by that?
Okay, so I grew up evangelical, Christian, religious, and I can go to church today and I know all the hymns. I know when to stand up, when to sit down. I know what the preacher's going to do. I know how to feel. I'm not going to stand up and swear or I know how to dress. That's the context that is so ingrained in me because that's how I grew up. It's a no-brainer. Or if I go playing cards with friends, or if I go to a sports event and cheering, I know those contexts well. So the question is, how do we create a new context? And this is really important. The ability to know what context we're in and have that higher level agency we talked about before so that we can choose the context we're in. There's a movie called World War Z with, I forget. It'll come to me. And in this, there's zombies, right? And if a zombie gets blood on you, you turn into a zombie. So the hero is running up the steps with his family, his wife and kids, and the zombie touches him and he doesn't know if he's been infected and will turn into a zombie. And if he turns into a zombie, he'll kill his family. So what he does is he stands on the edge of the building, like 15 stories high, and his feet toes just balanced just right. And his hope is that if he can realize that he's turning into a zombie and still have enough agency and the ability to push himself forward and kill himself so he doesn't destroy his family. So when we're in a context, let's say the context is you're out with friends, you're drinking, there's drugs, There's a lot of destructive behavior. In that context, once you're there, it's very difficult to even see outside of it to say, oh, okay, I'm going too far. I'm going to stop. Me, by looking back on my life, it's not there. So can we step into a context, know we're doing it, and with agency, then have the ability to step in a different context when it's appropriate? And that's the skill. And that's what I do when I work with my clients.
Yeah. So can you give us a couple exercises to kind of get that to that level of agency? Because it takes a lot of mental maturity, right? To get to that point in your life. And as you know, especially for young men, I think it's 25 is when our brain is fully developed into, all right. So can you give us a little bit of tips or pointers that you learned from what you've done with your clients, what you've done in your own personal life to kind of get to that mental maturity to the point where it's like, hey, as you said, it's hard to see how when you've gone too far once you're already in it. But can you get to a point where no matter which context you're in, that you have a high enough level of agency to know, to be aware and of what's going on, no matter what context you're in?
Oh, that's an excellent question. So we talked about the golden keys: awareness, acceptance, and then agency. So if you practice that on little things, like right now, again, I'll check in. Stomach's a little tight. Oh, shoulders are tight. So awareness, acceptance, that's okay. I understand I'm on a podcast. I'm excited. I'm enjoying this very much. I'm going to get the other exercise I do. Let's say somebody is, let's say, what would be a good example? As when I work with traders or professional money managers, they're noticing that they're just gods. They've just made several great trades in a row. Oh my gosh, I can do this. I don't need my system. I don't need any guardrails. I can go for it. So what I have them do is sometimes I'll work with people live while they're going through this, is they'll find a corner in their house or apartment that they normally don't go to, and I'll have them exaggerate. Now, I've never heard of a therapist or coach doing this because you don't want to exaggerate bad things, right? No, I'll have them exaggerate it. Oh my God, I can do anything. I'm a God. I can do it. And I don't have to listen to anybody. I don't need any guardrails. I don't need a system. Really get into it, exaggerate it, make noise, and then step out of it, take a breath and come back and say, the world is a complex place. There's a lot to learn. And everything I do is about process. I want to continually improve my process. What can I do to improve process that will encourage better outcomes? Okay, so now we step back into I'm great, and we exaggerate it, and then we step out of it into a rational person who's looking at improving their process. And we do it 5 or 6 times until finally that context of I'm a God, I can do no wrong, all of a sudden just doesn't feel right anymore. So rather than trying to, what you brought up earlier, John, about not trying to deny that part of yourself, if you exaggerate it, and then you can see how I create it. I use this language. I have this posture. These are the beliefs and thoughts I have about myself and the world. This is the model I'm using. If you're doing it intentionally, you can, and you need to create those, you can see how you do it. Then if you step out of it, you can see how you make that transition. And by going back and forth, then you're starting to get agency that says, hey, I am not this context, or I am not this context. I am the agent that determines what context is appropriate for what environment.
So let me ask you, we talked a lot so far about frameworks and mindset and getting to that level of agency and awareness, no matter where you're in. Let's talk bring it back to a little bit on the money side of things, right? Now that we've gone through a little bit of framework exercises and different things of that nature, from your experience, what would you say is the most common limiting anchor that you see that's holding people back from getting the amount of wealth and the lifestyle that they want to achieve?
I seem to attract really good-hearted people that want the best for themselves, their families, their communities, and the world. the other people aren't so attracted to me because there's just not, there's not a match there. So what these good-hearted people, that subconsciously they have some beliefs. And one is the one pie model of economics. There's only so much around. Like Roger Moore, the filmmaker, once said, there's only so much money in the world and it isn't theirs. So this sense of if I get more, oh, but do I deserve it? You get less. So that's a belief that we work on, and we look and change everything to value delivered. I mean, imagine, John, imagine if tomorrow morning, everybody in the world woke up and said, how can I deliver more value to my family, to my church, to my community, to my work? If everybody did that, you could say, how much value is there in the world? Well, the amount of cash money in the world may not expand, but oh my gosh, the amount of value we can deliver is infinite. So if we're delivering value to somebody, we're not taking money out of the pie. We're actually adding to the experience of everybody.
And I love that you mentioned that. Sorry, I was catching my breath. But I literally, yesterday night, from the day we're recording this, I was at a real estate investor meetup. And a guy who was there, he did a lot of big time deals. But he's a very untraditional guy. Like, he's gotten to that age in life where he's actually a lot younger than you, but he's reached that point in life where he kind of doesn't hold his tongue much, right? And so, but he was kind of mentioning about, he was talking about money, right? And he was asking us, is money finite? And a lot of people say, yeah. And then a lot of people said, no, right? Because money can be printed, right? And so if money can be printed, there's an infinite amount of money because governments would just make more. And if there's an infinite amount of, they do, right? And if there's an infinite amount of money, then how come we don't have any, right? Most people don't have any in this country. And then do you have to raise a question where there's, how much air do we have? There's a lot less air than there's money, but you don't hear people fighting about air like the way they fight about money and their finances. So it's like, how could we then tap into the flow of money so that we can be able to receive some of it and not just losing, kind of what you were mentioning about providing value. And when it comes to value, I feel like a lot of people, they don't have the confidence in themselves, right? Especially when they're young. It's like, oh, I haven't accomplished anything, right? What do I know? So what advice do you kind of give there to the listeners so that they can go out into this world despite their young age and still provide value to other people?
Yeah. So this is a great question because I have redefined money and I call it a certificate of appreciation. I got that from Walter Williams several decades ago. He was a Black economist way ahead of his time. And I was listening to him on the radio in the car and he said, oh, think about money as a certificate of appreciation. And that has stuck with me. So when you give a service to somebody, let's say you give a service to me and I hand you some certificates of appreciation. I say, John, here is my appreciation for the value you have added to my life, and vice versa. And one of the exercises I have some of my clients do is when they make a transaction, here are certificates of appreciation. Thank you. Or you receive them. Now, for the younger generation, which is a lot of people are anti-wealth, especially the ones coming out of higher education, and they think wealth is bad and rich people are bad. Here is something that just blows their minds. You talk about not holding your tongue, so I won't hold my tongue here. The more certificates of appreciation you collect, the more value you've delivered to the world. Oh my God, is that revolutionary? Now, there are people, Martin Luther King, for example, who've delivered a tremendous amount of value that has nothing to do with money. So we recognize the spiritual, the psychological, the emotional value that you can give to your family that has nothing to do with money. But for those who choose to be in the context of commercial relationships, if you can think of delivering value to others and get certificates of appreciation back, you don't have to feel guilty. You're not taking money from anybody else. What you're doing is creating more capital with your skill to be able to create more value for others. What a wonderful feeling that is. That just unblocks all that stress, all that pain, all those internal conflicts, all those demons from your family and from the past and from the current culture. What a relief.
So then let me follow that question up with providing value and certificates of appreciation, right? So when it comes to providing that value, right? And then we have how do I word this? When it comes to the certificates of appreciation, right? It's all about providing more value, as you were saying. And how do young people, right, determine which one is for them? Because that, right, now that they understand money, then the next thing is, well, there's so many roads to take.
Yep.
Which one is mine? Right. So how does one kind of narrow down which way? Because when it comes to value, there's so much value you can provide. Yet, with our unique skill sets that we all developed through our own unique lives that we lived, how do we determine which one will be the best for us to provide into the marketplace? And then the follow-up question to that would be, how do we know that the value?
If that wasn't big enough.
Yeah. How do we know that the value that we want to provide to the marketplace is a value that people are looking for?
Oh my gosh. Because I have 3 rules of money, and one of them is that value is determined by the receiver. In other words, a lot of us have the imagination that, in fact, I've done this, the biggest mistakes I've made in business, where I just start too big. I have an idea. Oh, this is going to be awesome. And I don't test it early. There's the concept of a minimal viable product where you just create the minimum and test it. Am I delivering value? So it's a complex question. There is no real answer for it other than what Scott Adams talks about is stacking skills. Try lots of different things. Find out where your skill set, they talk about follow your passion. Not all the time. That sometimes doesn't work because my passion may have nothing to do with anybody else in the world. So how do we connect? So rather than follow your passion, I would say meaning in life, check it out to see if delivering value to people isn't so rewarding that everything just kind of falls away. Everything else falls away by the side. So just test, try things, experiment. And this comes to failures. A lot of people are afraid to fail. One of my heroes is Elon Musk, who just on Twitter, he says, oh, we're going to do a lot of things that are going to be big mistakes. And then we're going to test them. We'll correct them. Totally unabashed about making mistakes. Look at all his rocket failures, how many mistakes he's made in his life. He'll continue to make them unabashedly. And the problem is a lot of us, our self-worth is so tied up to being perfect or not making mistakes that we're going to prove we're okay by not screwing up. And as a result, every little mistake, every judgment against us, every criticism we have goes right to the core and say, oh, maybe I'm not worthy. So if we're worthy, mistakes are just a wonderful way to give feedback. But making that transition from where we don't feel worthy, like if the story I told earlier about my internal limitations to where we do, that is not a trivial transition. But if you're aware of it and say, that's the transition I'm making, and you can visualize it, then it becomes possible.
So how do people then get into a heart of servitude, right? Because a lot of people try to provide value solely for the sake of getting money, right?
Mm-hmm.
And not realizing that our attitudes and intentions behind why we do things could also be a big limiting factor that they're not aware of because they think they're doing everything right. But if you're doing it for the wrong intention, that tends to lead to a lot of failed attempts and a lot of negativity and a lot of frustration. So how do we get into that heart of servitude so that when we get these certificates of appreciation, they're well worth it and we're doing it for the right reasons?
So a little red flag went up with the word servitude.
Yeah.
Because that then brings a conflict. Like my good-hearted clients, I want to be of service. I want to be of servitude. And that sometimes can be a cover for guilt, and it depresses our energy. So there are some people that are just out to make money. They're clever, they're smart, and they're honest, and they deliver value. and they don't care about servitude. They don't care about making the world a better place. If they can deliver value, and they may not even think of it in that terms, and make money, I'm good for it. Now, I don't think they're living as full or a rich a life as some other people. I could be wrong. But if our mission is to deliver value and collect as many certificates of appreciation as possible, that's okay. Now, there's a lot of people, myself included, since I grew up in a religious home and my father was a preacher.
Yeah.
There's just this servitude part of me. I mean, if somebody calls me up, do I charge them? No. Do I sell them? Oh, probably not, because there's that agreeableness, that part of servitude of me. But in like this whole thing of ESG and companies trying to be socially responsible and all that, that creates an internal conflict. And I believe that suppresses energy. And as long as you're honest and open, I have a dog barking there.
No worries.
So as long as you're open and honest and you are delivering value according to the person that's received it, I'm not so concerned about your motivations. Now, as a kind of if I'm a spiritual leader, then I'm going to invite you to a higher level of being. But it's not a problem. And I would caution the word servitude, maybe, not necessarily, but maybe an indicator of deeper guilt.
Yeah. So, Richard, we've gone through, your life story a little bit. We tapped into the frameworks and how to reframe some of the beliefs we have, not even with just money, but within ourselves, right? A lot of this stuff can be applied to whatever aspect and area of life that we want to apply it to. And we talked about reforming neurological pathways. We talked about a bunch of different topics, and then we tied it all into how can we kind of reframe our thoughts around money and providing value and redefining what money actually is. Where could we find out more about you? Where could we connect with you so that we can keep on tapping into this almost unlimited source of knowledge that you have from all your experience?
Conversations.money. And if they go to conversations.money/walk, WALK, there will be an invitation to join our free online course, which deals with a lot of these issues and how to get the book, A Private Conversation with Money, has a dozen exercises, and the online course has these exercises. Always happy to get emails, information. You can email me, rich@conversations.money, and always happy to respond and support. We have weekly group meetings. I do private coaching. So depending on your financial situation, what your goals and methods are, I'm just really, something, I want the world to be a better place for my grandkids. That's where my passion is. And if you can be clear about delivering value and making gobs of money, God bless you. I think that's going to make the world for my grandkids better.
Amazing. And now it's time for our final four questions, the way we end every single podcast episode. Without further ado, question number one: what is the most impactful lesson you learned in life?
I would say not knowing. I read a book by Peter Ralston called The Book of Not Knowing, and I was sure of everything. I needed to hold on to a truth coming from a religious background where I had the truth. I mean, it was the truth. Everybody else was going to hell, right? And I've transferred the content, but still it was the same process of having the truth. Letting go of that. Now that's scary because you are out there in a world with lots of input without having a framework of truth. But that has been probably the most impactful thing in my life.
What is the most admirable trait that a person can have?
Gosh, there's so many. I'll just go with honesty.
If you had to change someone's life with one book, which book would you recommend?
Yeah, I'd go with A Book of Not Knowing by Peter Ralston. It's a real slugfest. It's hard to get through because it demands some internal work that is very challenging.
And you kind of mentioned it already, but what is the legacy that you're trying to leave behind?
Wealth, meaning, and success actually produce a better world for everybody. If you have excess capital, and skills that made it, you can actually invest in things that create better experiences, health, and welfare for the entire world.
Amazing, Richard. Well, I genuinely enjoyed our conversation. I love how deep we got into some of these topics and the level of in depth that we were able to get into this conversation. I love the fact that you have a philosophy background, because I'm not too much of a philosopher. I don't know too much of the actual like core content, but I have a philosophical way of thinking about things. So I always love talking to people that also have a good philosophical view on the world. So I genuinely appreciate you hopping on the show and just sharing with us and my listeners all some of the knowledge and experience you've been able to gain throughout the years.
And John, may I give you an appreciation?
Of course, yeah.
You asked the hard questions, the really hard ones, but I think that's where we can all gain and move forward in our lives by really wrestling with those. And so my appreciations for bringing things up that are really a challenge. Great, great job.